Welcome to the pilot episode of the Based Boomer podcast on Eschatology Matters, part of the Fight, Laugh, Feast network. When I was invited to host a podcast called Based Boomer, I was blown away, given it was an answer to a long-time prayer, and then I was humbled. Me? Then to top it off, when it was from one of my favorite channels on YouTube, Eschatology Matters, I thought, God, now you're showing off. I'd been thinking about starting a podcast for a while because if you're going to build a platform nowadays, get your work noticed and so on, you got to do something like a podcast. But I'd been ambivalent because I have neither the time nor the expertise to do one. God settled the ambivalence for me. I was on the Conversation That Matters podcast with John Harris. And as you can see, he titled the episode, A Boomer, that's me, Gets Red-Pilled. The reason John had me on was because of my book, my latest book, Going Back to Find the Way Forward, Trump, A Great Awakening and the Refounding of America. As you can see on the cover, there are two hands, one holding a blue pill, one holding a red pill. This comes from the hit 1999 movie, The Matrix. Most people are familiar with it nowadays, but some aren't. If you're not, there are two options that Morpheus gives to Neo, played by Keanu Reeves. One is a blue pill. He takes that, goes on his merry way. Nothing changes in his life. Things are what they seem. If he takes the red pill, however, he goes down the rabbit hole, and the truth about the Matrix will start being revealed to him. So red pill has become a metaphor for basically an awakening in someone's life. So I told my wife after the podcast that having boomer in the title would be great, but I couldn't think of a B for the life of me. B boomer. What B? So then one evening out of the blue, I get a message from Brandon at Eschatology Matters via Twitter, asking me if I would do a podcast for them, believe it or not, called the Based Boomer Podcast. To say the least, I was blown away. It was the very last thing I was expecting. In fact, it brought tears to my eyes because I'd been wrestling, with this. Who doesn't want to get their work more widely known? I'm doing this because I love it. It's a passion. But so now I'm recording the pilot episode, and I trust this will be the first, God willing, of very many more. The reason I fell in love with Eschatology Matters is because it does. I didn't believe that for a long time. But I'll share some of my story as I go along, but realizing, just how much it does matter. Before I get there, I want to give an overview of the accepted breakdown people generally use when they're talking about generations. So we can see here, baby boomers. That's we famous boomers. I'll share a little bit of our story down there below, my wife and I. Generation X, 65 to 80. Millennials, 1981 to 96. I have three children. Two were born as millennials. My daughter was born in late 91, and my son was born in 95. Generation Z, 97 to 2010. That would be my youngest son. He was born in early 2002. And then Alpha, 2010 to 24. The woke, well, they're not the woke. Well, some of them are woke, but they're living in a woke world. My grandchildren would be that, and they are alphas, and they are definitely not going to be woke. I should also mention something I've learned since I decided to get active on Twitter earlier this year, 2024, for the archives. I noticed that baby boomers get no respect. After reading all the blame of modern ills that get dished on boomers, I felt like Rodney Dangerfield. I don't get no respect. If you're not familiar with him, that face tells you kind of everything. And that last one with Johnny Carson, just look it up on YouTube. You'll crack up. My dad used to watch Johnny Carson every night, and some nights I'd come home and there would be Rodney on, and just laughing so hard your gut hurts. This dissing of boomers, though, isn't anything new. You've probably never heard of the late, great Kevin Gilbert. He was an incredible musician in late-ish 80s and 90s, and in fact, he gave my brother Nick his big showbiz break. The album came out in 95, and the picture on the cover is so him. He wasn't a big fan of boomers and wrote this song called Goodness Gracious, expressing his disdain for my generation. Unfortunately, his manager wouldn't give me permission to use the music, so definitely look it up on YouTube. It's a great song. He wrote these lyrics in 1995. Goodness gracious, my generation's lost. They burned down all our bridges before we had a chance to cross. Is it the winter of our discontent or just an early frost? Goodness gracious, of apathy I sing. The baby boomers had it all and wasted everything. Now recess is almost over, and they won't get off the swing. Goodness gracious, we came in at the end. No sex that isn't dangerous, no money left to spend. We're the cleanup crew for parties we were too young to attend. Goodness gracious, me. As you can see, he was an incredible lyricist. And that last one is so incredible. I was younger than my sister. She's 4 years older than me. And even though we're younger boomers, we were the cleanup crew for the many parties we had at our house. So we baby boomers have been taking it on the chin for a long time. I don't suspect this podcast will be a defense of boomers because God knows my generation has introduced enough misery into the world to deserve it. But you will get a perspective of one boomer who the proprietors of this great channel think is based. You will, of course, have to come to your own conclusion. We should also discuss this word based. I got active on Twitter. As I did, I noticed people using the word based when phrasing something as an idea or person is based. I mean, it was obviously positive, but where did it come from? I asked somebody and they told me it came from Jesus' parable of the house built on the rock versus the sand. Of course, built on sand, it's unstable. Storms, wind come along, it blows down, but on rock, it can withstand all that. So I'm not sure where it really came from, but when I was asked to host a podcast with based in the title, it was quite the compliment. Now for my boomer bona fides, credibility as a boomer. I was born in the year of our Lord, 1960, and raised with the advent of sex, drugs, and rock and roll as America transformed culturally in what came to be called the 60s. I'm toward the younger cohort, and my wife, born in 1964, is at the very edge of it. I was born and raised in the Los Angeles area when California really was the Golden State. I loved growing up there, and our dad, along with my sister and brother, taught us to be SoCal snobs. Being Italian, we were Catholics, nominally so, but went to Mass every Sunday. I thank God for my exposure to this version of Christianity because it began my journey to becoming based. I got two critically important things out of it: a Christian worldview and a respect for the Bible as God's infallible word. We never read this big, beautiful Catholic Bible in our house, but we heard it read every Sunday in Mass. I went off to Arizona State University at 18, and when I was exposed to the Protestant version of it, and that I could be aware and assured of my salvation, I left Catholicism behind. Thus the journey really began, although the Hound of Heaven was after me from very early on. By the way, you should look up this poem. It's so spot on for all of us in our journeys. You can find my full testimony on my website under the Media tab. I shared it on the 180 podcast, and that link to that will be in the show notes below. I was born again, as we called it back then, in the fall of 1978. I got involved in the campus ministry organization that led me to Christ and became a serious disciple of Jesus, immersing myself in the Word and Christian fellowship. This version of Christianity, however, was kind of a fundamentalist faith, just me and the Bible, and it was anti-intellectual, anti-theological, and ahistorical. The first experience I had in my journey to based was discovering Francis Schaeffer in his book, The God Who Is There. I was introduced to apologetics through him, or defending the veracity of the Christian faith, and what having a Christian worldview means. All of God's truth applying to all of life. This includes politics. I discovered when Reagan was elected that I was a conservative and started reading National Review and the Wall Street Journal editorial page. That was how I was weaned on my conservatism. Over the decades, I became increasingly disillusioned with conservatism, what I now call con Inc., because it proved to be and has proved to be one big con. Politicians said all the right things, but nothing ever changed. The liberal progressive gains over the last century continued to expand, and the culture became ever more anti-Christian. Losing seemed to be part of the plan. As Steve Bannon calls the Republican Party pre-MAGA, the controlled opposition. I'm sure politics will get plenty of attention on this podcast. The next step in my based journey happened in February 1984 when I was 24 years old. I was introduced to Reformed theology and Calvin's soteriology, or how we are saved from our sin. The famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, acronym TULIP. I ended up going to Westminster Seminary, Philadelphia, a couple years later, where I met my wife-to-be, the very last thing I expected at seminary. I wrote my kids and her a little love letter in this book about our courtship, and what an incredible story it was. I loved writing it. The memories, priceless. We were married less than a year later. I was initially going to get a PhD, but decided against it, given I couldn't see another 4 or 5 years in school, and the leftist tilt of academia even then was less than appealing. We moved to Central PA, had 2 children, then moved back to SoCal, and then at the turn of the millennium moved to Chicago, where we were stuck for 17 years. We had another child, raised our kids in the faith, tried to make a living, and did Christian life as best we knew how. I became a Christian for one reason. I believed Christianity was true. If God was really there, I thought he deserved my all. I wasn't very good at the giving him my all thing, but being I was apologetics oriented, I raised our kids teaching them that Christianity is true, and that is the only reason we believe it, which gets me to my next step in the journey. This came in 2009 in a conversation with a coworker about Christianity, which took an apologetics turn. I hadn't studied any apologetics since my seminary days, apologetics, and this encounter showed I was positively horrible at it. I mean, it was pathetic. About that time, I bought a new car and had an auxiliary jack. I bought my first little MP3 player and started listening to podcasts, which were just starting to really grow at the time. I still use an MP3 player today, this one to be exact. Don't laugh. I'm an old school boomer, based or not. I also started reading everything I could get my hands on and was pleasantly surprised that apologetics resources had exploded since the 1980s. The next step in the journey came in May 2015 when I read a reversed testimony by a young woman who grew up in a Christian home, very committed Christian home, went off to college and became agnostic. This so ticked me off, and my immediate reaction was, this would never happen to my children. So I decided, I was going to write a blog post, but I decided I'm going to write a book. And this started my journey in becoming an author somewhat later in life, and the books you see here. My latest book is why I'm making this video. I tell my red pill journey there, and you can hear a fuller version of my conversation with John Harris, and there will be link on that below. But the reason Trump is on the cover is that he was and is the red pill that keeps on giving, and not just for me, but for millions of others. Thus, my conviction that God has used him to start a great awakening. You can read the details in the book, but for me and many others, it was the COVID scam that finally changed everything. That led directly to a compromised election. Not sure if YouTube will allow me to say the S word. J6 and the realization that the uniparty deep state is our enemy. I was as down as I've ever been after the election, but thank God I found Steve Bannon and his war room. Back then, he was actually on YouTube. Talk about a based boomer. I learned 2 things from him, among many. Both I should have known all along. That God has given us agency, which means we can change things. And all it takes is action, action, action. And a lot of prayer. As I always say, work like it depends on us, but pray because in fact, it does depend on God. This led to many other realizations, political, spiritual, and significantly one related to my health and modern medicine. I won't go into the details, but I believe God is beginning to make Isaiah 65 a reality for humanity. Never again will there be in it an infant who lives but a few days, an old man who does not live out his years. The one who dies at 100 will be thought a mere child. The one who fails to reach 100 will be considered accursed. You'll have to read it all and decipher what I mean. Understanding our health and modern medicine is definitely part of being a based boomer, and I'm sure that will be discussed quite a bit in this podcast. This brings me to the most unexpected red pill experience I've had, one that was completely unexpected. It was, in the much overused word of Vicini in The Princess Bride, inconceivable.
That would be inconceivable. It's inconceivable. Inconceivable. Inconceivable.
You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Inconceivable!
This truly is one of the great movies of all times. We saw it as our kids were growing up, I don't know, dozens of times. So, what was it for me that was so inconceivable? That is, unable to be conceived? Postmillennialism. I thought it was a completely discredited eschatology, unworthy of consideration. I was born again into a dispensational environment and accepted it because everyone else did. I was exposed to the alternatives in seminary, but over time I defaulted to being a pan-mill, because in my mind, contrary to the name of this channel, eschatology did not matter. It was the best speculation, and the Bible wasn't clear about it. So I figured it all would pan out in the end. So why worry about it? But in 2014, I was exposed to millennialism, and it seemed plausible and biblical, so I embraced it. And that's what I believed until August 2022, when postmillennialism fell out of the sky on my head. I have no idea why I put this James White video on my little MP3 player, but I did. My hope for the future really does say it all. Maybe it was the title, I have no idea, but God did. I was at my best friend's pad in South Beach, Miami, went out for a walk, and listened to White's sermon on my little MP3 player. When I got back, I told my wife, who was there as well, and my friend, I think I'm becoming postmillennial. I couldn't believe those words came out of my mouth. What sealed the deal was some weeks later hearing Doug Wilson say, postmillennialism gives you the theological justification for your optimism. Bingo. That was it. Exactly what I was looking for. I tell the story in my book, but I came to my optimism before postmillennialism, but didn't have any theological justification for it. Now I did. Postmillennialism colors how I look at everything. I never realized in the name of this channel how much eschatology really does matter. And what surprised me most was that the case for it was completely exegetical. It was scriptural from beginning to end. Not surprisingly, I'll be talking about a lot of that and the implications here for all of Christianity, the church, and the world. If you're still with me, I must briefly mention what finally brought me to becoming the fully based boomer I am today. That is the topic with which I start my book. It's basically my red pill journey, a reference to the 1999 movie The Matrix I mentioned and explained above. Here is how I start the introduction. When Donald Trump started his descent down the escalator at Trump Tower on June 16, 2015, there was a rip in the space-time continuum. I'm not sure what that means, but in God's providence, something clearly remarkable happened that day. This is so much bigger than Donald Trump, though, but it was the visceral response to Trump that triggered everything, and nothing remotely like it has happened in modern American political history. As we see every day, Trump derangement syndrome causes the deep state and its uniparty enablers to go to extraordinary lengths to try to stop Trump. In God's providence, that hasn't happened, and only God knows where it goes from here. So that's about it for the introduction, and since it is, I'll introduce you to my office, where I spend vast quantities of time, both in my day job, nasty habits, like having to live indoors, eating, stuff like that, and my avocation of writing, and I guess now doing podcasts. And since this was the first one, I hope it wasn't too painful to watch. And now, since this podcast will be for members, I hope you've heard enough to want to become members of Eschatology Matters, not just for one based boomer's perspective on things, but to have access to all the other incredible content that is for members only. You can learn more about that at the link below in the show notes. I hope to see you here soon.
Seated here at my right hand, the Lord to my Lord did command, for of these heathen I will make a kingly footstool for your sake. the Lord.